Hi, David. Okay. Oh, David, I did want to actually mention to you. I found the commentary that you had mentioned. Um, it's really a Baal Hamar. The Baal Hamar explains that there's a difference between a tree that covers a sukkah, that the tree existed before the sukkah is built, and the tree that is planted after the sukkah is built. What's the difference? Well, if the tree is there before the sukkah was built, so the sukkah never was really a kosher sukkah in the first place. In other words, it was a built in a way that it never actually carried with it an element of being a kosher sukkah. But if you built the sukkah first, and then the tree was planted afterwards. So then you have a scenario where it's possible that the sukkah could be kosher because the sukkah already um, had some type of a element of kashrus on it that the tree doesn't always ruin. It's a complicated way of explaining the Gemara because then he has to translate Bishachovtan a little differently. And the commentaries ask questions on that interpretation. I don't think that it's brought in halacha because if you remember, we saw in halacha like it spelled out. It doesn't make a difference if the tree was there before or after. If you remember, like in the wording of the Shulchan Aruch, like said that. So now we understand why it says that. The reason it says that is because it's saying don't follow this interpretation of the Baal Hamar. In other words, it's like spelling it out that there is such an interpretation, but we don't follow it in halacha. They ask questions on that interpretation based on the Gemara says a gzeira. We make a we The Gemara says we would think that you'd make a decree, and um, the according to the Baal Hamar, the Gemara's the Gemara should explain that the decree should be that we should make a decree that if the tree came afterwards, we should make a decree that the tree was there before a case where the tree was there before that you might make a mistake and consider it always kosher because if the tree came afterwards as kosher, so that would be something to make a decree. And our Gemara doesn't say that type of decree. Our Gemara says that we would think you make a decree about chavtan, about the combining them, or the way he translates chavtan is tearing them off. So in other words, according to his interpretation, the Gemara's it would have been more logical to make a different decree. So that's one of the questions they ask on this Val Hamor that it doesn't fit smoothly in the Gemara. Anyway, but in any event, what you did bring down, I guess there is what you said. You found some note over there. I don't remember. We didn't see it, but you did
I'm
find a
not
note.
sure if I'm not sure if it was in the note or something I thought of myself.
I Yeah, okay. It sounded like it was a note that I think you
Yeah.
quoted it,
Uh-huh.
but must have been in the beginning of the Gemara, maybe on the Mishnah even. Maybe that's where it was. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So so at least we
Because
found the source.
because
Okay,
because a person could build a kosher sukkah. He goes away on vacation for a year, and then he comes back, and he
exactly.
figures his sukkah is still kosher. And all of a sudden,
Uh,
his neighbor put up a tree
right,
that he didn't
right,
even know about, and all of a sudden, his sukkah is
right,
not kosher because a
right.
tree appeared.
Right, I hear you. And I'll tell you, it is a very practical point, and not because a new tree grew, but what often happens, like what I was always doing for many years, was cutting down a tree, branches from a tree that would grow over my sukkah.
And what
So
if it's not your tree?
I would get permission from my neighbor.
And what if he says no? Then what?
That's a good question, but so far they didn't say no. So every year I would cut it down. So in other words, there are many scenarios where your true sukkah is going to have branches growing over, and they continue to grow throughout the year. So that would be that would be nice if we could say it's exempt. But the
And
truth of the matter is, I don't know if he could say no because if it's growing on my property, I probably don't have to get permission from him. I probably am allowed to just chop it down. The only thing is, I like to chop it from the source. It was easier. It would have been so. I used to get permission from him to chop it on his property and cut it down.
And what if the neighbor's away and there's nobody to ask? Then
Yeah.
what?
Well, then you sometimes do things without permission. Yeah.
When it's on your property, you're allowed to cut it down.
Right.
Doesn't matter
Right.
what the other.
Right. Yeah. So seemingly it would be okay.
Ezra, I hope you're my neighbor.
Okay. So the Gemara. So anyway, so we've been learning all about the stuff.
I would cut down your tree. Period.
The Gemara that we've been learning was all about these scenarios where where you have a sukkah under another sukkah, different scenarios where it could be considered a sukkah tachas a sukkah, it's a sukkah under a sukkah, or it's possible that it's not because the one of the sukkahs is not really a real legitimate sukkah. And in that scenario, it wouldn't really be a sukkah under a sukkah. So our Gemara we had learned from the word basukais, which it says basukas, which means that it's supposed to be one sukkah. So you can't have a sukkah under a sukkah under a tree, or a sukkah inside a house. And the Gemara then brought Reb Yirmiyah, who gave us these four scenarios. A scenario where both sukkahs are going to be kosher, both sukkahs are not going to be kosher. We had a case where the bottom one is kosher, the top one isn't, or the bottom one is invalid and the top one is kosher. So we had these four scenarios. What was the case? So the case, just learning it very simply and surface level, is that the case was where both are kosher, where the bottom one is a minimal amount of shade, which means it has more sunlight than shade, and the top one has more shade than sunlight, which could mean that that together with the bottom, it makes it. No, it has to be actually more shade than sunlight, not together with the bottom, excuse me. The top one has more shade than sunlight, or definitely. And the bottom one has more sun than shade. So the top one is within 20 amos. So what happens then? So the top one is a kosher sukkah, but not only is the top one a kosher sukkah, the bottom one is also a kosher sukkah because it's relying on the schach of the top one. And it's considered like one big sukkah. So therefore, it would be kosher. Then you have the next case where both are invalid, and that's a case where both of them have more shade than sunlight. And the problem with the top one seemingly should be kosher then because it has more shade than sunlight. The bottom one would be a sukkah under a sukkah. So the top one, we need to explain why is that going to be invalid? And the answer was because it's above 20 amos, which the first Mishnah in our chapter said that a sukkah above 20 amos is invalid. Then we had the third case, and that was where the bottom one is kosher and the top one isn't. And the case was where the bottom one has more shade than sunlight, and the top one has more sunlight than shade. Why do we have to say the top one has more sunlight than shade? Because if not, then the bottom one would be a sukkah under a sukkah. So we need to say that the top one has more sunlight than shade. In this way, we call the top one a sukkah. That's the top one is not a real sukkah because it doesn't have enough shade. And the bottom one is called a kosher sukkah because the bottom one has more shade than sunlight. So the bottom one is a kosher sukkah, the top one isn't. Now the top one is within 20 amos. Now, why do we say that the top one would be within 20 amas, within 20 cubits? Why would we want to say that? Well, because if it would be above 20 cubits, then you would get into a different problem of the top schach being invalid schach. So although your sukkah is not a sukkah under a sukkah, but it would be a sukkah under invalid schach, because if the schach is above 20 amos, that schach is considered invalid. And therefore your sukkah would fall into question. Why would it fall into question? Well, because the non-kosher schach would possibly invalidate your sukkah on the bottom. In other words, schach that's above 20 amos could possibly invalidate your sukkah on the bottom, because basically what happens is the schach on the top, whatever it covers over, the schach that it covers over would be not considered schach. In other words, what is shading you from the sun? Invalid schach. The invalid schach on top, maybe not all of it, maybe not, your whole sukkah is not getting invalidated from it. In other words, there's not that much schach up on top that's invalidating your sukkah. It's more shade, more sunlight than shade. But the fact is, it's ruining all the schach that's directly under the schach that's on top. So the invalid schach on top, it's invalid because it's above 20 amos. That's ruining all the schach that's below it. And what could come out is that your bottom sukkah might be invalid. So how would your sukkah be valid on the bottom? If the top sukkah is within 20 amos, and therefore even the schach on top is not ruining your sukkah, because it's not called a sukkah under a sukkah, because the schach on top is not solid enough, is not quantity enough to ruin your bottom sukkah. To be called, I should say, to call itself a sukkah on its own, and it's not above 20 amos, so it's not considered invalid schach. And the bottom sukkah would be a kosher sukkah because it's not considered that it's under another sukkah. So here that would be a case of one is kosher, one isn't. Then you have the opposite case where the top one is kosher and the bottom one isn't. And that scenario was where both of them have more shade than sunlight. And the bottom one is, of course, invalid because it's a sukkah tachas sukkah. It's a sukkah under a sukkah. And the top one is going to be kosher. Why is the top one going to be kosher? Because it's under 20 amos, 20 cubits. Because it's under 20 cubits, it will be a valid sukkah, and the bottom one isn't, but the top one would be a kosher sukkah. It has enough shade. It's within 20 amos. So those would be that's the four cases that Reb Yirmiyah spells out. Then the Gemara asks, but now that you've explained these cases, they seem pretty obvious to fall within all the rules that we've learned. So what unique innovation is Reb Yirmiyah telling us? What's his chidush? What is his special law that he's coming to tell us? So the Gemara gives us an explanation that that one of the cases is unique. What's the case? The case was where the bottom one is kosher, the top one is not kosher. The top one wasn't kosher. The reason was because the top one has more sunlight than shade, and the top one is not kosher. But the bottom one would be kosher because the bottom one is a sukkah that is not under another sukkah because the top one doesn't have enough shade. So, and they're both within 20 amos from the ground. So bottom line is the bottom one is going to be kosher sukkah. So what's so special about that law? So the Gemara says you would think that maybe you should make a decree and say that that maybe we should make a decree. Maybe you're going to join schach puzzle together with schach kosher. Now, what did that mean? That you'd make a decree. You'd make a decree that maybe if the top sukkah is more than 20 amos, then you're going to have a problem that it's going to be joining the non-kosher schach with the kosher schach. And it would ruin the kosher schach that's under it. And so Kamash Malana comes and lets us hear that we don't make such a decree. We're not worried that you're building a sukkah, you have your sukkah, and even your top one is below 20 amos. We're not afraid that it's going to end up you permitting a sukkah that's above 20 amos. And then you would possibly ruin your schach. This would be a case where the top schach could ruin the bottom schach, whatever it's covering over. It would be schach puzzle would be covering over the schach kosher, and it would possibly invalidate the sukkah, but still we don't make a decree and we're not afraid of that. Of course, there's a lot of discussion here, but it's a little complicated. If you get, getting deeper into it and going into all the different opinions, but on a very surface level, it seems to be pretty easy to understand. So the next Gemara talked about the measurement between the two sukkahs. So in other words, we're talking about a sukkah that's under another sukkah, that it's invalid. How big does the top sukkah have to be? Now, obviously, the simple answer would be 10 tfachim, 10 handbreadths. That would be a very simple answer. Why? Because we know that the minimum size of a height of a sukkah is 10 handbreadths. We had a whole discussion about it earlier, learning from the Kruvim and learning from Halachal Moshe Sinai, and it was quite a discussion on Davav, and we had a nice lengthy discussion there. Got into the size of how big an amma is, how many tefachs. There was a whole discussion over there, and the conclusion is that the sukkah minimum size is 10 tefachim. But even though that's a minimum size of a kosher sukkah, nevertheless, our Gemara understands that it's possible that you could be transgressing the law of sukkah if your sukkah is under a sukkah that maybe is even less than 10 tefachim. In other words, to be a kosher sukkah, yeah, you need a 10 tefachim. But to be considered a sukkah under a sukkah, does the top sukkah, to invalidate your sukkah, does it have to have all the rules of a regular sukkah? Or is a sukkah called a sukkah under a sukkah, even if it's less than 10 tefachim? Even if it's less than 10 handbreadths. And basically, what the Gemara's, or you could use other words that say that what we're trying to figure out is what makes a sukkah two sukkahs versus one sukkah. That would be another way of wording it. Now, maybe we should call this one sukkah. It has two different layers of schach, okay, but it's one sukkah. So maybe that should be acceptable. So when does it lose that status of one sukkah? So the Gemara says, well, we do have other laws that talk about oihel tents, and they talk about eruvin, the laws of eruv chatzeros, and the Shabbos, the laws of a domain, and then of course we have the law, the simple law that we all know, that 10 tefachim is the kosher sukkah, is a 10 tefachim sukkah. So let's go. Let's start this Gemara from Kama Yehei Ben Sukkah LaSukkah. How much would need to be between one sukkah and another sukkah to call your sukkah a sukkah under a sukkah, and it's not considered one big sukkah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what about if there's two different owners? One person owns the top sukkah and one person owns the bottom sukkah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that making a difference. Seemingly, it's either a sukkah under a sukkah or it's not. Whether you own it or someone else owns it, it would seem that it could be considered one sukkah, or it could be considered two sukkahs. It doesn't matter if it's a different owner, as far as I understand, unless you know something different.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Because it's how can you say it's one big sukkah, but it's two different owners?
Well, that you're a partner with him. It's one big sukkah. It is a big sukkah. He happens to own part of it. He owns the other roof. Seemingly it shouldn't make a difference. Okay, so the Gemara says. So let me tell you where we are. Kama Yehei Bein Sukkah LaSukkah. So this is about 10 lines down from the top of the page, maybe 9 lines. Maybe 9 lines from the top of the page. Page 10a, comma, and in the art scroll, page 10a, 10a1 on the second column. And yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, the last question. Interestingly, the current chapter in Daf Yomi, which is the last chapter in Bava Metzia, deals with all different cases. I mean, like two dwellings, one on top of another, and all the various combinations as to like partial and total collapses, and like if there are two different owners, like who's responsible.
And what do you think about a sukkah? Should it make a difference if it's two owners?
I don't know.
So it doesn't really say anything about that there, huh? Okay. So yeah, so unless we know differently, I would assume that it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so the Gemara here, we're 10a, 9 lines from the top. Kama Yehei Bein Sukkah LaSukkah. How much is between one sukkah and the other sukkah? Utehei tachtoina psula. And the bottom one will be invalid because of it is considered a sukkah tachas hasukkah, a sukkah under a sukkah. Amar Rav Huna says tefach. The measurement of space needs to be at least a handbreadth. That's all you need, not 10 handbreadths that you would think. 1 handbreadth. And if you have 1 handbreadth, it's already considered a sukkah tachas a sukkah. It's considered a sukkah under another sukkah. If you have less than a handbreadth, fine, you can call it one schach, one roof. But if it's a tefach, we already have halachas that make that considered like a separate oil, separate tent. Shekin matzino balei tuma, because we find this with tents of tuma, that the measurement is a tefach. Shekin matzino balei tuma tefach. We find by the laws of tents for tuma tefach, the law of tefach, the tnan, because we learned in the Mishnah. This is the Mishnah in Olos, the laws of tents, in the tractate about tents. So it says over there, tefach al tefach. If you have a tent that is the size, there's some board on top, some type of a whatever the Torah calls a tent, which was like any covering. You have a covering that's a size, a tefach, 1 handbreadth by a handbreadth. The width and length is the size of a handbreadth. Berum tefach, and it's the height. It goes above the ground. A tefach. So there's at least a space of a tefach from the ground to it. Maybe as a tuma, it brings the tuma to anything under that oil, that tent. It also stops the impurity from going up straight above, called tuma ritzutza. It stops the tuma from shooting upward, from affecting anything above it. So, for example, you have this beam on top of. There's a dead body under it, and there is a vessel, some type of a utensil under it, and there's a space between this beam and the ground, tefach, a handbreadth. So the tumah of the dead body will actually affect that vessel. It'll affect the vessel that's on the other side of the beam. That's, in other words, on the one is in the east, the one is in the west, but it's both under the same beam. So the dead body will cause tumah to stay under that beam. It'll be like a tent that the whole beam will be covering. It'll cause the tumah to spread out along that entire beam, below the beam, and it'll make it invalid. It'll make everything tameh, impure. Now, what about if there's a vessel on top of the beam? So in this scenario, the vessel on top of the beam, and let's say the vessel is exactly on top of the dead body, on top of the beam, which is on top of the dead body. So it's exactly in the area of the beam, that the beam is on top of the corpse, and the vessel is on top of the beam. And the din is that the vessel is pure. Why is it pure? Because the oihel it contains the tumah, the tent, which is a beam in this scenario. The tent, which is of course a handbreadth by a handbreadth, it has to be at least 3 or 4 inches by 3 or 4 inches. So that beam is containing the tumah below it, and therefore the tumah doesn't shoot upward. But if the beam is not a tefach above the ground, then the tumah, the impurity, will shoot upward, and the vessel on top of it will be impure, but the vessel that's under the beam on the other end will not be impure, because the tumah is not contained under the vessel. The tumah shoots upward. So that's basically the laws of tumah.
Rabbi?
Yes, Moshe.
The tevach above the ground, even if it is, can a Kohen be in that environment, even if it is not
So
tumah?
seemingly he wouldn't, he would not be allowed to walk under that beam. The tumah would be contained under the beam. So he couldn't go under that beam.
I see.
So so the Gemara says, but aval pachos merum tefach, if it's not the height of a tefach, loy mevi v'loy chaytzitz. It does not bring the tumah to the vessels that are under. It does not to bring the tumah to the vessels, other vessels that are the vessels that are under the beam. V'loy chaytzitz, and it doesn't stop as a interpose between the dead body and the vessel above it. And instead, the vessel above it would become impure, because the tumah is retzutza. It's tumah by kas. The tumah goes upward, and it affects anything directly above it. And that would be if there's not a tefach, there's not a handbreadth of space. So here also, regarding similar to the laws of tumah, this law would apply to a sukkah, that the sukkah cannot have a tefach of space in between the bottom sukkah and the top sukkah. And if it would have a tefach of space, that would make it a sukkah tachas a sukkah that's under another sukkah. So even though the top sukkah does not have the regular requirements of a kosher sukkah, but to invalidate the bottom sukkah, it's still called a sukkah under a sukkah. Rav Chizda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna Amri, Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna say, Arba'a, that we go by the rule of 4 tefachim. Where do we find this rule of 4 tefachim? So the Gemara says, "Shalamatino makom chashav pachas me'arba." You never find the measurement of a domain to be less than 4, and it's referring to 4 tefachim, 4 handbreadths, and that's regarding a reshus hayachid, a private domain. It needs to at least be 4 handbreadths, and then it could be considered a domain of its own. If it doesn't have 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, so then it would be considered like a makom patur, like a no man's land. It would be even mutter, permissible maybe to carry from it to a private domain. So if you had such a domain next to a private domain, the makom patur, an area that's less than 4 by 4 handbreadths, and it goes, let's say, above 10 10 tefachim high. So that would be like it would be in a certain sense like a different domain than a private domain because it doesn't have 4 by 4 handbreadths, but it would be called like a makom patur, a place of exemption, because it's not even a valid location. It's not, it's so small, so tiny. It doesn't have it's not considered. It's not choshuv. It's not considered a makom. It's not considered a place of proper location because it's so small. So the Gemara understands that this is the rule regarding a horizontal space for 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. So the same rule should apply to a vertical, that you can't have a domain if there's no 4 handbreadths, and that would mean like a sukkah would at least need 4 handbreadths to be considered another sukkah. It's a very interesting comparison. In other words, we're really talking about a domain of area of space that's horizontal, and now we're sort of switching it and saying, well, adapting it to a sukkah and saying, well, that applies also to the vertical law, that the vertical domain would also be 4 handbreadths. Now, Tosfos seems to be bothered with that question, and he says that we find this regarding a shasayachid, a karmelis, regarding the horizontal domain, that it needs to be the rule of 4 handbreadths is a rule. We do find that with private domain. A karmelis is a in-between status property where it's not exactly used for a private as a private location or for public. Anyway, so the rule is that a karmelis, which basically means a widow, karmelis, it means like a widow, not the meaning of it is it's not a reshus hayachid, not a reshus harabim. It's not a private domain. It's not a public domain. It's somewhere in the middle, and that would be considered. You need it in order to be considered a karmelis. It also needs to have 4 by 4. And these are regarding the laws of Shabbos. Anyway, so the bottom line is, why should we say that applies to a vertical domain just because that applies to a horizontal? So Tosfos answers this problem by saying we do find such a thing even by height. We find such a thing even by height regarding, it says in the beginning of chapter Chaloin in Eruvin, it says that when you have 2 courtyards and you want to make one Eruv Chatzeros, you want to make one Eruv that you could carry in both of these courtyards. You don't have to make one Eruv. You could each make your own Eruv. But if they want to make one Eruv, so if there's a wall separating between these 2 courtyards, that would not be, you would not be able to make one Eruv Chatzeros for both. Eruv, one way of being able to carry in the courtyards, and from courtyard to courtyard and so on. You wouldn't be able to do that, make one Eruv for both, from house, one courtyard to the house of the other. You wouldn't be able to make that one Eruv if you can't really go through, because there's a wall blocking. However, if there's a window in between that could be used as a door, that would be kosher. How big does the window have to be? 4 handbreadths. We found a case, a source, that you see that it's used not only as a horizontal space, the number 4, but it's also used as a vertical size. The number 4 handbreadths is used, and therefore the opinion of Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna is that 4 would be the measurement. That would be the measurement that would be cause a sukkah to be considered under another sukkah, as if the top sukkah has 4 handbreadths of empty space, then the bottom sukkah would be called a sukkah tachas a sukkah. It's a sukkah under another sukkah. Okay, now we continue. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says asara, the typical answer, which is 10. 10 is the size. Why? My time of the Shmuel. What's the reason of Shmuel? So he says kach sheira, kach psula. The way the measurement that makes the sukkah kosher, that's the measurement that would make the sukkah below it. That would make it considered a sukkah to passel the sukkah below it. It would be the same measurement. That's a kosher sukkah. So that means that the sukkah under it would be, that's the measurement for the psula. Just like the kosher sukkah needs 10 handbreadths in order to make it kosher. And if it doesn't have 10 handbreadths height, it would be invalid. So af psula, also the way of the invalid sukkah, because it's under to invalidate a sukkah that's under it is also basara. It also would be the size of 10 handbreadths. Now, what happens if it's not the size of 10 handbreadths? Then you could have a sukkah under it, and it wouldn't invalidate it. What would it be considered? It would be considered, as I explained earlier, it would be considered like one sukkah. It's not really two sukkahs, it's one sukkah. Okay, so the Gemara says, Kanan. We learned in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, Rabbi Yehuda says, if there is no one dwelling in the top sukkah, the bottom one is kosher. Now, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, you got to think back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, sukkah under a sukkah, the top one is kosher, the bottom one is invalid. But Rabbi Yehuda came up with this idea that no, the bottom one could be valid if no one's living in the top one. Okay, why should it make a difference if anyone's living there? So the Gemara is now going to go through this. The Gemara says, "Ma'in diurin." What does it mean? No one's living there. Ilay diurin mamish. It means physically living there. Atu diurin kagarmi. People who live there, they ruin a sukkah. They make it considered a. They make your sukkah considered a sukkah. And the bottom one is now considered a sukkah. Tachas a sukkah. Like, well, why does someone have to live there in order to ruin your bottom sukkah? Did the diurin cause a problem? Elalav, rather, my ain diurin. What does it mean that there is no one living in the top sukkah, and then the bottom one will be kosher? It means kol she'ena ru'uya l'dira. If it's not fit for dwelling, then if it's not fit for dwelling, we won't call it a sukkah. V'hechi dami. What would the case be? Deloi gavaya asara. If it's not fit for dwelling, what would seemingly that would be a case where it is too small. If it's too low, you can't dwell in it. It's not fit for dwelling. So if it's too low, what is Rabbi Yehuda saying? That a sukkah that's 10 tfachim. You're right, rabbis. The bottom sukkah is a sukkah tachas a sukkah. But if the top sukkah only had 9 handbreadths, so Rabbi Yehuda says, in that scenario, I'm not calling the bottom sukkah a sukkah tachas a sukkah under a sukkah. Why? Because the top sukkah is not fit for dwelling. It's too low. And because the top sukkah is not fit for dwelling, it's not called a sukkah. And the bottom sukkah that's under the top one is not called a sukkah under a sukkah. And that would be Rabbi Yehuda, who argues on the rabbis. That would mean that the rabbis would hold that a sukkah that's 9 handbreadths, and that's the sukkah that's on top of another sukkah. So that would mean that the rabbis would hold that the sukkah below it is invalid because it's under a sukkah, and it doesn't matter if it's fit for dwelling or not. So in other words, we're basically using Rabbi Yehuda to tell us what the rabbis would hold. So let's continue. How could this be? Talking about a case that it's not 10 tefachim high. So Rabbi Yehuda would hold that in such a scenario, the bottom sukkah would be a kosher sukkah, even though it has a sukkah on top of it. But since the top sukkah is only 9 handbreadths, so it's not going to ruin and invalidate the bottom sukkah. Michlal, the Tanakama Savar, this implies that the first opinion of the Mishnah, which we generally understand to be the general view, the first opinion is Savar holds, Avalpi she'ena ru'ya l'dira psula, even if it's not fit for dwelling, which would mean it's not 10 tefachim high, it would be invalid. So in other words, you, Shmuel, are generally, we would assume you follow the rabbi's opinion, and what you're saying doesn't seem to fit with our Mishnah, because our Mishnah seems to imply that even a sukkah that's not fit for dwelling is still called a sukkah that would be would invalidate a bottom sukkah. Again, is this clear? You have a top sukkah that is somehow invalidating the bottom sukkah. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says that if it's not fit for dwelling, it doesn't invalidate the bottom sukkah. That means that the rabbis hold that even if it's not fit for dwelling, it will invalidate the bottom sukkah. And the Gemara says the case is probably talking about that it's not 10 tefachim high. That would be a case where it's not fit for dwelling. So now what do we have? We have an argument between the rabbis, the first opinion of the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda, the second opinion of the Mishnah. If a sukkah that's not fit for dwelling, that sukkah that's 9 handbreadths or less high, if that will invalidate a sukkah below it. The rabbis will hold that such a sukkah invalidates the sukkah below it. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not fit for dwelling. It's not going to invalidate the sukkah below it. So according to that, it seems like Shmuel is wrong. The Gemara is asking a strong question on Shmuel. Then the Gemara says, Ki asa Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. So when he came, Amar, he said, Amri b'ma Rava, in Eretz Yisrael, they said that Imein hatachtoina yechayla lakabel karim uksasos shalal yoina. If the bottom one, meaning the roof of the bottom one, if the roof of the bottom one is not able to handle the cushions and the pillows and the cushions of the top one, in other words, that people could sleep there on the top one, so it's not strong enough. So then hatachtoina ksheira, then the bottom one will be a kosher sukkah, because the top one is not fit for dwelling, because it's not strong enough to handle it. So again, similar to what was mentioned earlier, maybe yesterday or 2 days ago, with regard to the strength of the sukkah. How could you dwell in a sukkah like it has these bamboo? If it's not fit for dwelling, that's what it means. That's what Rabbi Yehuda's statement really means. That if ein diur and belyon, it doesn't mean if people don't live in the top one. It means if it's not fit for living, because they can't handle it. People are gonna fall through, or they're not gonna be able to. Seemingly it means they'll fall through. So if it can't hold it, then it's not called a real sukkah, and the bottom sukkah would be a kosher sukkah. Now, what would the rabbis hold? So the Gemara says, Michlal, from this it implies the Tanakama Savar, that the first opinion, who argues on Rabbi Yehuda, he holds, Afal pi she'ena ru'uya lakabel psula. Even if it's not fit for dwelling and for holding these cushions and these maybe mattresses or pillows, so even if it can't hold it, it would still invalidate the sukkah under it. Now, if that's so, the Gemara's understanding that the sukkah that invalidates a bottom sukkah, it doesn't really have to be a legitimate sukkah. Because look at the Tanakama's opinion. The Tanakama, the first view in our Mishnah, holds that even if you can't even put your sleeping items there, it's going to invalidate a sukkah that's under it. So if it doesn't need to handle the necessities for sleeping in the sukkah, and yet it still invalidates it, So the same law the Gemara is thinking should apply about the 10 tefachim. That why does it need? Why would it need 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths to invalidate the bottom sukkah? In other words, initially the Gemara thought that we have an answer. What did the Gemara think? That we have an answer by saying, you learned it wrong. It's not that it doesn't have 10 tefachim. Doesn't mean it's not that a sukkah that doesn't have, you can't dwell in because it doesn't have 10 tefachim, and then it would be a kasha on Shmuel. Because the Tanakama would hold that even if it doesn't have 10 tefachim, it would still invalidate the bottom sukkah, and that would be a kasha, a question on Shmuel. Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael. He said, no, it's a different pshat. The different pshat is that it just means if it's not strong enough to handle. And so let's learn Shmuel. Shmuel says the sukkah has to be a valid sukkah, 10 tefachim high, and then it invalidates the sukkah under it, and everyone agrees with that. But Rav Yehuda says another point, that it needs to be also be a strong schach, that it needs to be like, as I gave an example, of maybe like 2x4s. If you use 2x4s as schach, so then, maybe then it would invalidate the sukkah below it. It's a strong sukkah, and your bottom sukkah is strong. It can handle it. But if it was a bamboo mat, so then Rabbi Yehuda says that's not going to invalidate your sukkah. What about 10 tefachim? 10 tefachim it has to have to invalidate a bottom sukkah. But if it's made from bamboo mats, that's not going to invalidate it. So that answers Shmuel. Shmuel holds it has to be 10 tefachim. Everyone agrees it has to be 10 tefachim. But if you make it out of bamboo mats, that's not strong enough. So Rabbi Yehuda says that's not going to be called a sukkah under a sukkah, because the top sukkah is not fit for dwelling, because you can't even so you can't sleep there, you can't lie down, you can't, nothing, it won't be able to hold stuff. So you're not calling that a sukkah. It's not called the sukkah, the top one. And therefore the bottom sukkah is not called the sukkah under a sukkah. The rabbis would argue with that. Okay, but it has to be 10 tefachim. But the Gemara says, no, think about the logic. The Gemara says, even if you learn it the way Rav Dimi learned, you're still going to have a question on Shmuel. Because the Gemara says, Mechlal, from here, I understand that the Tanakama would hold that it doesn't have, we don't care about if it's fit for dwelling. So if it's not fit for dwelling, it implies it doesn't have to be 10 tefachim either. In other words, it goes hand in hand. It's one idea that the Rabbi Yehuda holds it has to be fit for dwelling. The rabbis hold it doesn't have to be fit for dwelling. So if they hold it doesn't have to be fit for dwelling and it still will invalidate the sukkah below it, that would mean that it's a kasha on Shmuel, that it really doesn't have to have 10 tefachim and it still will invalidate the sukkah below it. Just like if it invalidates the sukkah below it if it can't handle your sleeping items, your sleeping furniture. So the Gemara says, Ika beinayu. The difference is the choyla lekabel al yedei hadcha. The rabbis really agree with Rabbi Yehuda in the extreme case. In the extreme case where it can't handle your sleeping furniture, even the rabbis agree that's not going to be a valid sukkah to invalidate your bottom sukkah. That's not going to be called a sukkah that would invalidate your bottom sukkah. It's not going to do that because it's not fit. You really can't use it for dwell. What about if you could use it that it's yachol kabel al yedei adchak, could handle your sleeping furniture b'doichet it's not so comfortable, it's not perfect, it's shaky a little, but it's safe. So if it would handle it, that it would shake, but nevertheless it would be able to handle it. That's where there's an argument here, where the first opinion of the Mishnah would say that that it's considered a sukkah and it will invalidate the bottom sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it has to be a decent sukkah, not that it's going to shake and be weak. It has to be a very strong sukkah, and therefore it won't invalidate the bottom sukkah. But everyone would agree that it needs to be fit for dwelling. So it needs to have 10 tefachim according to Shmuel. So that would be in other words, that would be the understanding that that it would need to have 10 tefachim, but it would it wouldn't need necessarily to be able to be a solid sukkah. That would be a machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama in the first opinion. So that's the this is the Gemara here explaining Rabbi Yehuda's view. We just concluded this Gemara. We're up to the next Mishnah. We're on page 10a, and we're up to a new Mishnah about spreading a sheet over your sukkah for shade from the sun. Okay, so let's start the next Mishnah. Pires aleha sadim mipnei hachama. If you spread out on your over your schach, you spread out a sheet mipnei hachama because of the sun. So you basically want there to be more shade than you have, which of course you have kosher shade already, but you're gonna put a sheet on top of it in order to give yourself more shade. The Mishnah continues, Oy tachteha b'bnei hanashar. Or you put a sheet out, not on top of the schach, but under the schach to catch the leaves. So the schach has leaves sometimes, and you want to put a sheet under the schach because this way the leaves will be caught and they won't fall into on the table and the floor on the food. So or you spread a sheet over the kinayf. The kinayf is the 4 poles of the bed, and you spread a sheet over it. You have to keep in mind, we're not so familiar with this because most of us don't sleep in a sukkah. We rely on different leniencies not to sleep in a sukkah, but there are many very religious Yidden who very, want to love mitzvahs and they want to sleep in the sukkah. It's part of the mitzvah is really to sleep in it. We have a tatum to not to sleep in it, but there are many people that do. So they actually they bring their beds into the sukkah, and so if you had you spread out a sheet above the 4 corners of the 4 poles of your bed, and I'm not sure if it's some type of a decoration. It seems like it's a Lanoi. Rashi says it's like a decoration on your bed. So anyway, so you put this on. Psula, the sukkah is invalid. However, you would be allowed to spread a sheet over a naklite hamita. So there's kinoif and then there's naklite hamita. What's the difference between kinoif and naklite hamita? The kinoif is the bed that has the 4 posts, and naklite hamita is a bed that has basically 2 posts, two poles. And that you would be allowed to spread your sheet over. And the reason is because since it only has 2 posts, so one by the head and one by the feet, and it would be considered just like a sheet without an oihel. It's not a tent. Why is it not a tent? A tent needs to have a solid handbreadth of area that it's covering. If this is a triangle, it's slant. So, and the actual top doesn't have a flat tefach, a flat hand breadth, that it's exactly flat. So if you made it a little flat, you would ruin it. But if you just have it's just hanging on the poles and it's just slanted, then it's not an actual oyel, it's not a tent that would invalidate your sukkah. Again, we'll have to see in the Gemara all about this, but the Mishnah is basically telling us the general rule over here that a sheet on top of a 4-pole bed that would invalidate it. A sheet on top of a 2-pole bed would be kosher. The Gemara continues. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda says that when you spread the sheet and it invalidates the sukkah, so it's loishano ela b'nei hanashar. You spread it under the schach. We're talking about the second case of the Mishnah. So it says that it's only that it only invalidates it where you spread it because you want to catch the leaves that are falling down. And I should mention Rashi, interestingly, adds a point over here in the Mishnah. Rashi says in the Mishnah that the sadin, the sheet, is something that is makabel tumah. It is considered something that receives tumah. It is like a finished product, the sheet, and it is able to be a recipient of impurity. And therefore, something like that is considered pasul l'schach. It's invalid for schach. And so you're putting this on the under the schach, and you're putting it there for the Mishnah's cases that you put it there to catch the leaves. But if you put it there in order to decorate the sukkah, then it wouldn't be a problem. It would be kshera, it would be kosher. Gemara says pshita, of course, mipnei hanashar tanan. The Mishnah says that it's you put it there because of the leaves that are falling, and they shouldn't fall in your food, and that's why you put it there. So if you put it there for beauty, the Mishnah implies like it's not going to invalidate it. So the Gemara answers, Mahu de temahu adin da afilu l'na'isa. I would think that maybe even if you put it there, the same law would apply if you put it there for decoration. Nevertheless, in this that it says that you're putting it there because of the leaves that are falling, orcha de milsa katani, it is giving you the common case that it's that the leaves often fall, and why would you want to put it there because of the falling of the leaves? And that was just giving you a typical example, a practical case where you would want to put it. So Kamash Malana comes and lets us hear that that there is a difference, and if you put it there for the decoration, that would actually not invalidate your sukkah. Of course, we'll have to learn more about this, Metz Hashem, tomorrow. Now, I just want to mention I'm going to be going out of town for 2 weeks, Metz Hashem. So I plan on still giving my classes as much as I can, except that tomorrow you're going to have someone else because my flight is partially during the time. So I'm going to have someone give the share. I'm not sure yet who, but I have 2 people in mind. But anyway, so hopefully everything should work out smoothly during these next 2 weeks, but I'm not going to be home. So I did want to ask you, is anyone interested in doing like a daf yomi style of doing chazara from the beginning until would anyone like a more like a review for these last 9 pages that we've learned, and maybe do like a page a day, just go do a review, or does everyone want to continue? What do you say, Jeffrey?
Finally, I got myself unmuted. I think a review would be great. I know I couldn't attend every time, so it would include some of what I didn't hear first class.
Uh-huh.
And I think summertime is a good time for reviews.
Anyone else? Mordecai? Victor?
Yeah, I'm okay
David?
with it. I'm okay
What was
with
that?
it. I said, I'm okay with the review.
Okay with a review? I think
Yeah.
Ezra's nervous of a review. Ezra, you Ezra? Oh. Victor? Anyone?
I think either way is good.
Either way is
It's
good?
either way, both ways are good.
Yisrael?
I think that reviewing is appropriate because there are certain passages in general that are a little more complicated, and I think that would a review would clarify some of those things to some of us.
Okay. All right. Anyone else want to share, say anything
I'm in favor of a review also.
in favor of a review? Okay. Sounds good. So, Metz Hashem, maybe tomorrow I'll have whoever teaches maybe do the next piece, and then we'll start the review the day after, I guess. Okay, sounds good. Sei gesund. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
All right.
Thank you,
Have a good
Rabbi.
trip.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
safe
you.
trip.
Safe travels,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Safe travels.
Thank you. Amen.
So-